Hebrew, they say Menachem lo chashuv, aval ken chashuv.
Yeah. Good morning, dear friends. Thank you for joining us on this auspicious Rosh Chodesh Adar Rishon, the 30th of Shvat, the first day of Rosh Chodesh. Tomorrow will also be Rosh Chodesh. It's February 1st, so I dare say it's Rosh Chodesh February 2, and we are here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Still chapter 11 of Shabbos, still page 100b. Today, with Hashem's help, we'll turn the page possibly to 101. We're talking about different unique scenarios of Hotza'ah, or actually here being Mavir Dalet Amot, causing something to travel for Amos. We spent a while talking about a Mishnah, about an item that you threw, and it overshot your intended distance. Patur. What happens if you, just make sure I get this right. If you overshot and you intended to throw it within 4 amas, if you passed 4 amas, you said you're exempt. What happens if the reverse happened? You threw it outside of 4 amas and it bounced back. The Mishnah says you are chayiv. The question was, why would you be chayiv? And Rabbi Yochanan said it would have had to first rest, come to a complete stop outside of the 4 amas, and then it came inwards. And we discussed how it's plausible that something might not actually come to a stop on top of something, but the wind could suspend it in a manner that it would consider to have come to rest. And then if it would bounce back, there is a hypothetical, there is a scenario where one could be chayiv. That is what we read in the last Mishnah. Again, we're getting in I don't want to say into the weeds, but we're getting into some of the unique, interesting scenarios of Hotza'ah. And as soon as we finish these next few lines, we're going to begin a discussion about the status of the sea. Remark, I hear you are uniquely surrounded by the sea. So we'll defer to you. Well, we're all close enough to the sea, but I think we can see the ocean in the background. Beautiful. Okay, maybe we'll use your circumstances to inform our discussion. Let's see. But you don't...
Yeah, we're still wondering if this is actually an error, because the walls are pretty straight up around it with rocks. Whether it's a natural error, we never determined that one. But I'm coming back. I'll be back there for this anyway, so it doesn't matter.
Okay. But enjoy.
We'll have to do those classes on the beach.
All right, let's share the screen. Let's get started. Okay, of course, I have the wrong text open, so bear with me just a moment. We'll open Sefaria, Talmud, Shabbos. Continue reading. Let's get our Hebrew and our English. And we are just about there. So following our discussion about the bouncing or rebounding item you intended to throw. And again, we talked about dodgeball, not dodgeball, handball, or maybe even thinking about the ball that, what do you call it when it goes into the rim and then it pops out? Sometimes you want the ball to go somewhere and it ends up somewhere else. So, Amar Rava. Rava taught another halacha. It's also familiar, and this is a pretty brief discussion, but I wanted to save it for this morning. Amar Rava. Hoich shloisha. If something lands or flies in the air within 3 tfachim, L'Rabbanon sorich hanacha al gabe mashu. According to the position of the Chachamim, it would yet need to actually be landed on something. So basically, when the Chachamim say that if you're within 3 tfachim, you're considered on the ground, we don't mean if you're suspended in the air, says Rava, it would actually have to land on something. So sometimes you have a little pole sticking out of the ground, or I don't know what, a little flag or something that maybe wouldn't be considered a proper hanacha. But if it lands on something within 3 tfachim, then it's considered on the ground. This is the teaching that Rava says. Rashi, the pligi oleha de Rabbi Akiva, the rabbis who argue with Rabbi Akiva in the question of throwing not to give everyone traumatic flashbacks. Okay, not traumatic, wonderful flashbacks. A few weeks ago, days ago, we talked about if you throw something from a private domain to a private domain with a public domain in the middle, and the Chachamim say you're not necessarily chayiv. They do not believe kiluta kamishahuncha, They don't believe that something that is suspended in the air is considered to be upon the ground. Even if it's very close to the ground, even if it's within 3 tvachim, and usually we say lavud, 3 tvachim is as if it's non-existent. We talked about a legal fiction that compresses the space, and the space is as if it isn't there. But the Chachamim would say, Sorech sheyanuach. It has to actually be on top of something. And if it just passed, sailed through the public domain, never came to rest on anything, even if it came super close to the ground, potter, one is exempt. By nafkamina, what would be the halachically interesting and relevant scenario? Lizoyrek dalet amis. If you also throw something 4 amis in the public domain, this is our gemara. Ukishabalo nuach, and when it's ready to rest, the gia l'toich gimel, and it's already climbed or passed 4 amos. He ends up having regret, changing his mind. When we say to okay, so here he makes. Let's forget about that for now. Suffice it to say, there are all different halachically relevant reasons why we want to determine if something that is suspended in the air is considered already on the ground. Let me explain to you what Rashi said. Why do we care if it's 3 tvachim above? Eventually, it's going to land. So why do we need to parse if it's considered to have landed now or the split second later? So Rashi tells us there are times that something changes in your machshava, and that might have bearing on the status of shkag or mazid or whatever, if it was intentional or unintentional. And therefore, it is important to know, even if it's eventually going to actually land, it's important to understand when halachically it is considered to have come to a complete and total stop. It reminds me, I think we just discussed this recently on the plane. You have different dinim of stopped. You ever notice that? The plane comes to a stop, and then the pilot announces, please stay seated until we come to a complete stop. Hey, and then it seems to stop again, and then they tell you, no, don't stop. And then without any further stopping happening, they tell you, okay, now we stopped. Right? So you have to ignore. Yes.
And for the knowledge of Chabad of Australia, what about a boomerang? We considered everything else.
Beryl, you're mechavan. I think yesterday we actually talked about boomerangs, not with any halachic authority, but we did mention the idea of a boomerang. So it's interesting that you bring that up. A boomerang is an interesting shiloh that probably needs to be kept apart from this discussion for a few reasons. Number one, it's possible, again, I don't know the exact science of a boomerang. I've never been to Australia, and although I have seen boomerangs, I've never seen them in practice. Do boomerangs in truth come backwards, or is that just a
They do come back. I've had them as a toy, when I was a child, and definitely come back to you.
So it's a good shiloh, right? But Beryl's asking good shiloh. What happens?
We have to ask Rabbi New. The whole family is there.
We'll have to ask the Australians. Right, there was a simcha, right? There was a wedding.
I have an
Anyways.
additional question. What happens if you throw it and then you realize that you threw it and you weren't supposed to throw it? And before, let's say instead of 4 amos, within 3 amos, you run and you catch it.
First of all, that's pretty fast and athletic of you.
Yes, I can do that.
But listen, you could do a diving catch and you could pull it in. And we'll go back to our football analogies for a moment. That's saving the ball from going out of bounds. It happens. It's a good shiloh. Probably we can only look at the reality of the event in such a scenario, but
isn't it the same shiloh if somebody would catch it while it's flying?
Maybe.
No, but you yourself are catching it. Someone else catching it would consider be able to hanacha.
Well,
but here yourself are catching it.
So Dr. Stamler, here the question just for the moment is going to be not about going from one domain to another, but about 4 amot in a Rishus HaRabim. So if somebody catches it in less than 4 amot, ostensibly or possibly they have saved you from a malacha, even though your intention was to do a malacha. But I think when you catch it yourself, it's a bigger question. Well, you catch it yourself, you avoided it traveling 4 amos. But what happens if you throw it unintentionally and then you remember and you try to catch it and then you miss the catch because we're not also athletic. So that's the scenario that Rashi, I think, is referencing. That without getting into the details, it's possible that there are halachic, there are ramifications as it pertains to the kapara, the atonement for those things. All right, let's
What a scenario for a touchdown.
Rabbi,
Doctor, go ahead.
quick question. Just want to clarify lanuach when it comes to rest. That means rest. It doesn't mean, for example, I won't give a football scenario because today is a special day. We know who retired officially today. But I'll give you a basketball scenario. Instead of throwing a chest pass, you throw a bounce pass to somebody. Okay. Did the ball come to rest? It hit the ground. Forget about the height. That's another issue. But in both cases, is it lanuach when it just hits the ground, whatever kind of ball it is, and then goes into the other rishus?
What about if it hits the rim of the basket and comes back?
No. But this is more realistic. You're having a catch with somebody, a neighbor, and in between, and then whatever. So that's the question.
This is a good question. So in other words, what is considered to have come to rest? Is a
Right.
bounce which is still in motion?
Right.
Yeah, very good question. Very good question. It's a good question. From our Gemara's conversation, it sounds like perhaps it is considered a hanacha,
Mhm.
which possibly, but I hear why it's complicated, and I want to get you a better answer, because could one then plausibly engineer a pass in a way to not be ever going for Amos and Rosh Hashanah? That's a good question. Good question. Let's leave it as a question, but it's a good one and worthy of some exploration going forward.
Well,
So
I'll
again,
put it on the list. We still have that old list.
yes, 627 items are
Right.
currently on.
Okay.
But this should be bumped up to the front. Amar Rava. When the rabbis who don't agree that something that is in the air could land, they see it actually needs to land on something. Yosef Mareimar v'Kamala Shmatza. So Mareimar was reviewing this teaching that he heard from Rava. Amar le Ravina le Mareimar. So Ravina comments to Mareimar and tells him the following: Lav Hainu Masnisin. Your comment that that Rava says that it needs to actually rest al gabe masha, who it actually needs to come to rest on the ground. This is not identical to our Mishnah. What did our Mishnah say? What did our Mishnah say? So Rashi helps us out. Chutz la'arba amos v'nisgalgel. If something went more than 4 amos and then rebounded, bounced backwards, or blew backwards, chayiv. Our Mishnah says you're chayiv, and Rabbi Yochanan says v'hu shenach. It has to actually rest on top of something. Halaynach. By the way, this is probably, Dr. Hammer, this is probably just about the scenario of the bouncing ball.
Right.
But I want to make sure that we give it its full attention. So that's why I said to keep it on the list. Rabbi Yochanan says it has to actually come to a rest. It has to stop. It cannot just be going through the air. So is Rabbi Yochanan's comment that it needs to actually rest identical to the teaching of Rava that it needs to come to an actual rest? Rabbi Yochanan says it needs to be nachal gabe mashu. Rava says it needs to be nachal gabe mashu. Are they saying the same thing? Amarlei Marima says to Ravina, Miskalgu kamris. Hold on, our Mishnah is not talking about that it came to a rest. Our Mishnah is talking about that it's continuing to bounce. Probably, Dr. Hammer, your scenario, Miskalgu and soife lenuach, when it's still moving or bouncing or rolling, it's not resting. But in our scenario, why are we distinguishing between Rabbi Yochanan's scenario, which is a ball that is bouncing, and Rava's scenario, where it's flying through the air from one private domain, I believe, to the other? So he says there's an important distinction. In our Mishnah, it is rolling. It's not going to come to a rest. If it's not going to come to a rest, then it's going to have, if it's not stopping, at least it better touch the ground. Rava is telling us that even in a case where it is going to land, and we'll see Rashi in a moment, it still actually has to land. The moment of Chiyuv is the moment that it lands. Let's read some Rashis and let's see if we can. Misgalgal kamers, davar shirach megalgaloi va'aver kamers. Keeping the seifel noach. V'niskar ashlei noach nima kimunach dami da seifel noach. Okay, basically the distinction here is, in one case it's about to rest, but in the nisgalgal case, it's not entirely determined what this scenario is going to be. So Rava adds a chiddush. Even when it's about to land, it's not considered to have landed until even when it's about to land and it's very low on the ground, even then it needs to actually come to land on something. So the rabbis have an extreme anti-kaluta commission huncha standard. They have a strong extreme position that says, even if it's very close to the ground, it has not landed until it is actually landed. I believe that is the point that we are making over here by Rava.
Rabbi,
Yes.
is there any consideration about the object that you're throwing? Let's say you're throwing an object because you want to have it be there where it's going to land, and it breaks, and now it's useless to you. Is that any consideration at all, the object itself?
I don't know. I don't know.
One of the problems,
Like
if
shooting
you,
clay pigeon.
if you say that landing isn't necessary, is
Right.
that if you're throwing an object, particularly any kind of a ball, and let's assume it's going to change the height. In other words, if it hits a rock, it could get higher,
Right.
rather than lower. So you're talking not only about gravity, that you're making assumptions, but it's not at rest, and therefore the whole issue might change regarding the requirements. Yeah.
Indeed. So here's what I understand based on the Rashi that I read earlier. Something that's about to land, but it didn't land yet. Do we care if it lands now or in a split second? So usually not. Rashi gave us a situation where it would make a difference. What if the person had a change of his mental status or a change of his kavana status, I should say? That might make a difference. What about something else? What if you're playing a sports game and your friend, lacrosse or highlight, a sport that you can scoop up, right, and save the ball or catch the ball, or a diving catch in baseball? So you're right. What if somebody alters the state of the ball when it's within 3 tefachim? If halachically it's landed, well then they may, for the purposes of the sport, there may be a different halacha. For the purposes of Hilchas Shabbos, it's already landed in the eyes of halacha. Whereas if you say it actually needs to touch the ground, maybe that would have some hashpa'ah. Maybe that would have some influence on the halachic ramifications. And for that reason, Rava gives us an opinion, a strong opinion, that it has to actually land on something. Until it's landed on something, I don't care if it's really close. I don't care if it's just about to land. Until it's landed, it hasn't. Again, just like our pilot.
Right.
So that is what it appears to be the deal. Let's take a look here if he has Mishnah. Let's look at this Rambam again. We read this Rambam earlier when we were studying the Mishnah that spoke about this, but now we'll see the added wrinkle of our Gemara, and now we'll understand the question that we asked back then about the text of the Rambam. Pen? Your pen or pencil? Here we go. Again, we're on the side here. I'm going to highlight. Again, we studied this text, but now we're going to understand an added detail that the Rambam added that we did not quite understand when we saw it last time. Hazorek mirshut hayachid rishut hayachid. You're throwing an item from one rishut hayachid to the other. Rishut harab be'emsa, and in between there is a rishut harab. Afal pi she'avar hachefetz ba'avir rishut harabim. Although the item went in a airspace of rishut harabim, one is pater. He is exempt. It didn't stop in the rishus harabim. If it would stop in the rishus harabim, obviously he would be chayiv for causing an item to go from a private domain to a public domain. Here, it's just stayed consistently in a private domain. What's the chiddush? The chiddush is that it's in the airspace. And maybe the airspace interferes halachically with the item to cause a person to be chayiv because it's in the airspace of the Rosh Hashanah. We know the Rosh Hashanah, the airspace is not quite the same law as the Rosh Hashanah. But let's see. When are you potter? Only if the item was above 3 tvachim. If the ball is, I'm saying ball, but if the item, our illustrator likes to show a loaf of bread. If whatever you're throwing is really close to the ground, vinach al gabe mashahu, and it actually temporarily landed on something, afal pishin nekar, even if eventually or ultimately it continues its trajectory by bouncing. It ultimately bounces or rolls or flies into another domain. The bounce, I think, the stop, the pause, because it came to a moment of landing in the public domain, therefore one is chayiv. So back up. We learned a mission that talked about throwing from one rishus to another. Maybe you recall there were 3 different interpretations halachically about the machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. One said they always argue, one said they never argue, and one said, okay, no one said they never argue. And one said that the whole machlokes is above 10 tvachim and under 3 tvachim. Sorry, the whole machlokes was between 3 and 10 tvachim, but if it's over 10 tvachim, everyone says you're potter. Under 3, everyone says you're chayiv. The rabbi said, Rava says, when do the Chachamim say that under 3 tvachim you're chayiv? It actually needs to land. It actually needs to land. Noch al gabe mashu, and that's what our Gemara here is coming to add. And I think, Dr. Hammer, I think this is answering your bouncing question. Even though ultimately it continued traveling, and it ended up in another rishus yachid. It's as if in the eyes of Allah it remained standing, or it stood in the rishus rabbin, because even though it didn't land on the ground, it only landed on something protruding but really low to the ground. Love what exists, and it came to a rest for a moment. You're chayiv, certainly if it actually touched the ground. Hold on. But if it crossed the same thing within 3 tvachim, when we read the text last time, we asked, hey, where did this v'nach al gabi mashu come from? We never mentioned resting on something. We said it traveled in the airspace. Well, it's the addition. It's an addition that we just created right here, right now in our Gemara. And that's why, although it is, one might say, a somewhat obscure or short little text, I wanted to give it proper attention today so we could actually observe that this is although it's a small blip on the radar of our Gemara study, it actually weighs importantly in the halacha l'maisa area, or at least in the Rambam's Pesach halacha, about what's considered when it's considered to have come to rest in the public domain. And ultimately, I just want to point out, this is a kula, this is a leniency. Realize we're saying you're not chayiv if it just passes through and dips close to the ground. It actually needs to come to hit the ground or rest to some extent in the other domain. 3 tvachim suspended in the air is not enough.
Rabbi.
Yeah, to go back to the football example, landing is questionable because it's like a receiver. He has to control the ball for a certain amount of time to be considered a completed pass. So landing is a question.
Yeah. So you think Tom Brady is going to be bored now?
Yeah.
I have a question also.
Okay, go ahead.
What if it's a 12-year-old who throws the ball? Is he exempt?
Explain your question, please.
Well, we know an adult is not, pardon me? I know when an adult throws it, there's a problem. But if it's a 12-year-old, he's still under bar mitzvah.
Okay.
Is he exempt?
So he has the treatment of whatever the treatment of a 12-year-old will be our treatment of this 12-year-old.
Right.
It's not a specific question or discussion in the laws of Shabbos. It's the laws of bar mitzvah. And I'll tell you where it gets interesting.
Add it to the list of Baruch Shepatrani.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. So that is that. Now we're starting a new Mishnah and an important Mishnah. Especially important for people who live on a peninsula or an island. And if I'm not mistaken, Montreal is also an island, right?
Only in the summer. In the winter, it's land. You walk.
But we have Mark is certainly on an island. Mark, you're not on any island, you're on the island, right? So it is
On the island,
Nogea.
yes, sorry, I didn't unmute.
I'm sorry.
Rabbi,
On the island, yes.
Rabbi, seriously.
Now, I still, there's a cement thing going all around, and then the rocks. It's pretty vertical, and it's more than the 10th fucking for sure.
Rabbi,
Let's not let this is not a shear that is halacha l'maisa. I don't even want to tease that we're talking halacha l'maisa.
But Rabbi, what's interesting when you talk about water, how do you paskin when it's ice, and you could stand on it, etc., etc. Not that we want to go there, but it just occurred to me. It must be an interesting topic.
It's a good shaila. So we have to start from the beginning. We're going to start with the basics. And the basics are
why would it be different in a sea than in a bowl with water that you remember where we had whether it would be or become part of it or not part of it or just floating on top?
That good question. So let's see. We're going to see what the Mishnah says.
For that matter,
we will see what the Mishnah has to say about the sea, and then we can apply and compare and contrast and challenge why the Mishnah does or doesn't give it the same halachic treatment. But first, let us see how the Mishnah views the sea. And it's going to be this journey is going to span a few Mishnahs. It's actually going to take us all the way to the end of our chapter 11, which is not that far off. But the next few Mishnahs are all on the subject of the sea, or almost all, at least until on the subject of the sea. And so we will spend some time on the matter. And let's take a look. Hazoyrek Ayam. Is it called water polo? You're throwing an item.
It's called playing Marco Polo.
Marco Polo. Hazoyrek b'yam arba amos. The person throws something on the sea or at sea. Putter. He is exempt. Biblically exempt. Why should somebody be exempt for throwing something for amot on the sea or at the sea? Because halacha is a yam is considered a karmelis, and midoraita there is no prohibition for throwing something for amis in a karmelis. Midrabanan we shouldn't do so. Midoraita one is exempt. Let us take a fast look at the Shulchan Aruch. This is not really the best way to do this, but let's do this. Ezohi karmelis. the Shulchan Aruch, which is summarizing the earlier halachic works, which are summarizing the Gemara, which is summarizing the Mishnah as well. Okay. Ezohi Karmelis. What is a Karmelis? Makom she'ein hiluch l'rabim, a place where the majority of people are not able to navigate and walk around. What is a prime example of a place where the majority, the populace, have a challenge navigating easily? Kigoin Yam, for example, and the very first example is the sea. Now listen, the Shulchan Aruch and the Gemara and everything, they know that people go into the sea and they swim, or they play Marco Polo or water polo or whatever else it is. But yet, it's not the same easy access for large quantities of people. And oh, by the way, it adds also Bika, Vitztavnis, Vitztaba, other structures that are not quite a public domain. And he talks about halacha. So, just let's take a fast like the Mishnah Brura. He says a sea, but who had the nahar? The truth is the same thing would apply to a river. Although, as Rabbi Menachem asked, certainly water doesn't entirely eliminate the borders, the walls, and therefore, just like a pit has water, it should be chayv yishlemer. The kolchoritz she'eni mushpa kadesha tilaket gavi al ramas lo yahaver rishus yachid. As long as the walls are sloping or broad, it's not considered a rishus yachid. And the common way of sea beds or edges is that there's a gradual sloping, not always, but many times. The Meiri says another reason, the Mishum, by the sea. The sea walls are very wide and apart. They do not have the capacity to enclose and create that which is between them. So, for example, the Atlantic Ocean, if we look on a map, we might conclude is very much enclosed, but it's such a distance that a person isn't able to see it and conceive it, and it is not considered a rishus hayachid. Even if the walls are very steep and a sharp incline, it would yet not be considered a rishus hayachid. So we gave a few different opinions. I don't know if we want to go in depth over here. Suffice it to say, we've made the point that a sea most certainly is not considered a rishus hayachid. The walls are far apart from each other, and they usually are very gradually sloping, etc. Now, a river is a little more problematic. It says, a river, in truth, has two borders that are quite close to each other. However, if you think about it, the other two walls of the river, if they exist at all, are quite a far distance. They do not connect, and so a river too would be considered a karmelis. Anyways, okay, there are other scenarios that need to be considered, and we'll see them in our Mishnah. So suffice it to say, a sea, the sea, is considered a karmelis. It's not a rishus harabim because it doesn't have large conventional traffic like a street does. Even though there could be many boats, should that make it to be considered a rishus harabim? Excuse me. Boat traffic and navigating boats are still much more complicated than foot traffic. Also, there's no comparison to the rishus harabim, which was the original encampment of the Jewish people in the desert. And it's not a rishus hayachid, as we just explained, because it doesn't have proper walls that enclose it. So, midaraisa, biblically, you're allowed to play water polo in the sea. I'm not saying you should do it. Midarabanan, there might be a lot of problems. But midoraita, it's not. Now, let's see. Im haya rikak mayim. What if it wasn't quite a sea? If there was a marshy, swampy puddle, Ureshus harabim mahaleches boy, and there's a public domain passing through it. By the way, Florida, much of Florida, especially to the west, although probably our area too, was once not quite inhabited or inhabitable. Much of South Florida in particular was marshes that were drained. And so it's not implausible that you could have a Rishus Harabim, a road going through, and on both sides, you have marshy, swampy grass and water and alligators. So we'll see the definition of exact halachic definition of Rikak. But suffice it to say, if you have a puddle, a marshy puddle, and the Rishus Harabim passes through it, if you throw 4 amis into that scenario, then one is chayiv. Why? Well, let's see. What makes something to be considered a marshy, watery, waterlogged ground as opposed to the sea? If the depth there is less than 10 tefachim. Rashi. How shallow can a puddle be to still be considered part of a Rishus Harabim? The Lenasa Karmel is up to 10 tefachim. It could be considered sagi, public area. What happens if you have a swamp and a public domain passes through it? Then one is chayiv. Anybody notice something wrong over here? Anyone see something wrong with this text? Maybe the word wrong is strong, but did anyone see something troubling?
Are you using the depth of the water as well?
Mishnahs don't usually repeat themselves. Take a look at this. You have a rekak, this swampy situation. The
first one doesn't specify the depth, and the second one says the 10 tefachim.
The first one, says 10 tefachim, right? Excuse me.
No, the second one says. First one doesn't say anything about that. It just says if one throws it.
Hold on.
The second time they mentioned the 10 tefachim, not the first time.
There's also something else. One says Hazarik Litoichai, one says Hazarik Bitoichai, but it looks like it's saying the same thing. The Gemara is going to ask this question. So, but it's a pretty resounding question. Let's do something a little bit less conventional. Let's look at our Mishnah here.
One says pachot, one says less, the other doesn't.
Where?
Yeah.
Where?
The first one doesn't say anything about that.
That's about the 10 amas.
No. It says the halacha, then it asks what's the definition, and it says the same thing again.
Oh, so the second part's really the definition of the first. But what?
No. Im haya rekak mayim. You have this swampy, marshy situation. Rishus Harabim maleches boy, and there's a Rishus Harabim passing through it. What is the halacha? Hazoyrik letoicha yarba amas chayiv. You throw into it your chayiv. Kamahu rekak mayim. Now we need a definition.
What is it? Okay, less than 12.
Now that we have the definition, let's continue our conversation. Rekak mayim Rishus Harabim maleches boy. Same thing. Rekak mayim Rishus Harabim maleches boy. Here it says rekak mayim Rishus Harabim boy. Hazoyrek betoichei arba amas chayiv. The only actual textual difference here it says hazoyrek betoichei, and here it says hazoyrek litoichei.
Yeah.
Is that of halachic significance?
But there's no real difference.
Well, there could be if letoicho could be from a reshut hayachid to reshut harabim. Betocho, you're within the reshut harabim.
So one sounds like you're throwing from the Rishus Harabim into the rekak mayim, and one sounds like you're throwing it. But either way, So the Gemara is going to give an answer. I'm just curious. The Mefarsh, it's an obvious question, and so let's see what the Gemara has to say about this. Did we miss a Rashi? Rekak is a garbila. What's a garbila? Sand, gravel mixed with water. That's what Rashi seems to be. That's what Lazi Rashi says. All right. Let's take a look at the Gemara. One of the rabbis told Rava, Bishlema, Hiluch, Trei Zimni. I can understand why we talk twice about a public domain passing through a rikak. I understand why it has to be mentioned twice. There's two halachas to be inferred. We'll read it and then we'll try to understand it. Hakamash malon, hiluch al yidei adachak shmei hiluch. A roadway that's kind of rough to navigate is still considered traveling. Tashmish al yidei adachak loy shmei tashmish. But using an area that's kind of rough is not considered conventional access. Ella rekak trei zimni lamali. But why do I need two mentions of the marshy land? So the Gemara answers, chad b'yimoisach chama, chad b'yimoisach shamim, because the very same area isn't quite the same in the summer and the winter. How are they different? Hold on. Don't ask any questions because we're still trying to figure out what it's saying.
No, but the Everglades, you have that. There are times I've been there, you could walk
right
200 yards.
Yes, that's what we're saying here. Because right in Eretz Yisrael and in that region, in the winter, it was very rainy and it was probably harder to navigate. In the summer, it was drier, right? And so there's very big difference between what an area looked like in the summer and the winter. And that's why we need to mention it twice. If I only mention once, I would say, you know what? In the summer, when the water is very low, there's almost no water there. Davidi, actually, no, let me take that back. He doesn't make that distinction now. I say, you know what? In the summer, people want to go in the water. You know why? Davidi inshi dimaski lakuri lashayu. People sometimes are looking for a splash pad. They're looking for a place to get wet. In the cold winter time, no one is looking to get wet and cold. And so there is something unique about the use of or walking through a puddle in the winter. But if we were exclusively talking about the winter, I would say like this: the kivan dimitanfi, in the winter the roads are muddy. You're already so dirty. Like ichbas, there's a certain point where you're such a mess you don't care to get messier. But maybe people do not navigate. Maybe people are not going to walk into the puddle in the winter, in the summer. Therefore, the Mishnah comes to teach us that the halachot and the status of a public domain remain so in the summer and the winter. That if there is a main road, even if it dips into a marshy area, the assumption is people will commonly continue to navigate it, and therefore the road that runs through the Rakak has the halacha of a public domain, notwithstanding a considerable change of the terrain. Let's see Rashi. Hilo. The nakat trey zimni rishus rabim mehalechas boy. Chad the member of the ein regilin lahalech boy potter. Hold on, let's go back again to the Mishnah. Rishus rabim, excuse me, mehalechas boy. The nakat trey zimni rishus rabim. Twice we talk about the scenario of a public domain. Mehalechas boy going through a rekak. Chad lemember the ein regil nahalech boy pater. One is teaching that it has to be a place where people go. If people don't go there, then indeed it is not a public domain. But when people do walk through it, you're chayiv. It's considered a public domain. Even though it's less than ideal. Okay, very interesting. Our Gemara says Hiluch needs to be said twice. One, to teach us that even if it's inconvenient, a roadway will still be considered a roadway. But we do not suppose that people are going to use this space for other functions. And therefore, when there's water, it's not considered a Rishus Harabim for certain other uses. For example, we talked about Mekatfin, that people adjust within it or place stuff down. For that purpose, it might not be considered a Rishus Harabim. Why do we need to know twice that when a person has to navigate complicated terrain, it's considered Rishus Harabim? And the Gemara answers, one is talking about the winter, one's talking about the summer. And although it's the same road, the circumstances are vastly different between the summer and the winter, to the point where a Mishnah will do something that's pretty not typical, to mention almost the same thing twice. One, to give us coverage for the winter. One, to give us coverage for the summer. Abaya has another way of understanding our Mishnah. Abaya says, you know why the repetition happens here? Istrich. Sakadaita chamina. I might suppose if it was only written once, Hanimili heicha dolei hava ara amis. Maybe if this rekak, if the swamp is pretty narrow, less than arba amos. Rashi, Rachab, dolei tircha lehu milsa lavar b'toichai. It's a very small patch. If it's very narrow, but if it's a very deep or wide space, maybe people would go around it. Kamash Malon, regardless of the size or the dimensions of the swamp, a person goes through it. Let's read Rav Shlomo there. It would have entered your mind to say that these matters apply where the swamp is not 4 cubits wide, because then people walk through the swamp, they don't go through it. But when the swamp is 4 cubits wide, people walk around it to avoid going through the swamp at all. So basically, possible that not all rekaks, not all swamps, not all puddles are created equal. And if anyone's ever had the privilege, the joy of walking with a kid after a rain, a child, a grandchild, you might know that there is some children have a particular joy in spotting every puddle and jumping into it. And you might try to convince the kid to go around it. This might have happened once or twice in the history of human beings. And so here Abai is saying maybe it has to do with different size puddles. Maybe sometimes you'll avoid them, sometimes you won't. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches us, no, these puddles have the halachic treatment of a public domain if they run through a road runs through it, regardless of their dimensions. Rav Ashi says, no. You know why the repetition exists? Maybe when is it considered Rishus Harabim? When it's 4 tefachim. If it's a little puddle, mifsa psile, people just step over it, and then it's not considered a public domain. Rav Ashi follows his reasoning. He says that if you throw an object and it comes to rest on the beam of a bridge, he is chayiv, even though they're very narrow, but a narrow thing with in the public domain, we'll see Rashi in a moment, is considered still part of the public domain. Let's see Rashi. I'm sorry, did I read this? Did I say Arba for Tvachim? I'm sorry, no. Arba Amos.
Yeah, throw it Arba Amos, but the beam has to be Arba Tvachim. Remember, to be a different domain, it had to be Arba Tvachim.
Yes. Now here it looks like we're talking about Tvachim here, which is weird because Rashi.
Yeah, because you got Arba Amos is in your chayav. You throw it more than Arba Amos, but it's Arba
Hold on
Tvachim
one second.
changes its status.
Okay, it looks like there's actually there's a big discussion here if it's Arba Amos or Arba Tvachim. Usually Arba would mean Tvachim, but Rashi clearly had a gears that says Amot. So that's what's confusing me here.
Yeah, but we always know that for beams, for things to become insignificant, Arba Tvachim was the magic number.
Right.
Smaller than Arba Tvachim is not considered a gap.
But 4 Tvachim is so small, it's almost obvious that a person would pass through it.
Arba Amos would be impossible not to. You couldn't jump over Arba Amos. You have to do roughly like I could. You have to be.
All right,
really
let's
good
just it looks like Rabbi Steinsaltz here is explaining it according to the Ar Nosach, which says Tfachim. It says very simply, every little component of the public domain is considered part of the public domain. We don't suppose that a person can or will step over it because it all combines to one thing. Just like a bridge that has a bunch of beams, every beam, even if it's individually minor, it combines, it fuses together to all be considered a public domain, and therefore even a minor puddle or a minor marshy area, according to Rashi, is considered part of the public domain, and therefore one is chayiv, and therefore it's listed twice for a small marsh and a big marsh, and that is how Rav Ashi would explain it. My dear friends, oh wow, it's already 11 o'clock. Folks, thank you so much for joining us today in our journey through the Talmud. I should mention, I didn't say in the beginning, that we dedicate our learning for the well-being of our dear members of the Chabura and their households, praying for only good news, healthy news, happy news, particularly as we begin our 2 Adars, 60 days of simcha and joy. And so thank you all so very much. And again, being that we are sea people, this is an important sugya. And thank you all for joining. Hope to see you all tomorrow. Gesundheit. I'm going to end this link, and then in just a moment, everyone is invited to rejoin to study today's portion of the Chumash. A big, big Yasher Koyach. Thank you.
Yasher Koyach. Chodesh.